The first time I noticed it, I chalked it up to the trick of the light. Mrs. Gable, our new neighbor, was tending her petunias, her head tilted towards my house. Nothing unusual there, but as I watered my own window boxes, I realized her blank stare wasn't on my garden. It was fixated on my living room window, and her eyes, they didn't seem to blink. I dismissed it. Maybe she was lost in thought, or perhaps the sun was in her eyes, though it was a cloudy afternoon. But the next day, and the day after that, it continued. Every time I glanced over, whether I was leaving for work, getting the mail, or just looking out the window, Mrs. Gable was there, somewhere in her yard, her blank stare locked onto my house, and those unblinking eyes, they were starting to get to me. It wasn't a quick glance either. It was a sustained, intense stare. Sometimes she'd be pruning her roses. Other times she'd be sitting on her porch swing, but her head was always turned, her eyes wide and unnervingly still. I started making excuses to avoid looking in her direction. I'd rush to my car, keep my head down when collecting the mail, but I could feel it, that invisible weight of her blank stare on the back of my neck. One evening, as I was making dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I peeked through the curtains. There she was, standing at the edge of her lawn, just inside the shadow of her oak tree. The twilight painted her face in stark contrasts, making her unblinking eyes seem even larger, darker. A shiver traced its way down my spine. What was she looking at? What could possibly be so fascinating about my ordinary house? The question gnawed at me. Was she watching me? Was there something about my routine, my habits, that had caught her attention? Paranoia started to creep in. I found myself double-checking the locks on the doors and windows, even during the day. I'd draw the curtains earlier than usual, creating a sense of false security. Days turned into weeks, and the unblinking vigil continued. It became a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in the background of my life. I started losing sleep. The image of those wide, still eyes burned into my eyelids. Finally, my curiosity and my growing fear reached a breaking point. I had to know. I had to try and make contact. One Saturday morning, I decided I had enough. I took a deep breath, walked out my front door, and headed towards the property line. Mrs. Gable was in her usual spot on the porch swing, her blank stare fixed on my living room window. As I approached, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. What would I say? "Excuse me, Mrs. Gable, why do you keep staring at my house?" It sounded crazy. I stopped a few feet from her porch. "Hello, Mrs. Gable," I said, trying to keep my voice even. She didn't respond, not a flinch, not a nod. Her eyes remained locked on my house, unblinking. "Mrs. Gable?" I tried again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. It was like she was in a trance, completely oblivious to my presence. I took another step closer, my hand hovering hesitantly in the air. Should I touch her shoulder? The thought sent a jolt of unease through me. Just as I was about to speak again, her head tilted, ever so slightly. It wasn't towards me, it was tilted upwards, towards the roof of my house. And then, for the first time since I'd noticed her, her lips parted. Not to speak, to smile. It was a slow, deliberate smile, and it was the most unsettling thing I had ever seen. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, too wide, and it didn't reach her unblinking eyes. And then I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from inside the walls of my house. It was a dry, scratching sound, like tiny claws on wood. Mrs. Gable's smile widened further, her unblinking gaze still fixed on my roof. "They're almost ready," she whispered, her voice raspy, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. My blood ran cold. What were almost ready? And who were they? I took a step back, my eyes darting from Mrs. Gable's unsettling smile to my house, listening to the faint but growing scratching sound within the walls. The scratching intensified, growing louder, more desperate. It sounded like it was coming from the attic right above my bedroom. My gaze snapped upwards, following Mrs. Gable's unblinking stare. "What's in my walls?" I managed to stutter, my voice trembling. Mrs. Gable just continued to smile, that unnerving, distorted grin. "Patience," she rasped, her eyes still fixed on my roof. "They're hungry." Hungry? The word sent a fresh wave of fear washing over me. What kind of creatures could be living in my walls, and why would Mrs. Gable be watching them? Was she feeding them? The scratching became frantic, clawing like something was desperately trying to get out. Dust began to drift down from the eaves of my roof. "What are you doing?" I demanded, taking another step back. "What's going on?" Mrs. Gable finally turned her head, her unblinking eyes now focused on me. The smile remained, but there was something else in her gaze now, a strange kind of triumph. "They've been waiting," she said, her voice low in an eerie whisper. "Waiting for the right time." The scratching sound abruptly stopped. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the gentle breeze blowing the leaves on the trees. Then a new sound emerged from the attic, a wet, tearing sound, followed by a soft thud. My breath hitched in my throat. Something had broken through. Mrs. Gable's smile stretched even wider, if that was possible. A single tear, black and viscous, ran down her cheek. "They're here," she whispered, her voice filled with a disturbing sense of joy. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this house, from this woman, as possible. But a morbid curiosity, a terrifying need to know what was happening, kept me rooted to the spot. Slowly, hesitantly, I turned my eyes back toward my house, to the attic window. The glass was still intact. But behind it a shadow moved, a dark, elongated shape pressed against the dusty pane. And then a single, pale finger, impossibly long and thin, curled around the edge of the window frame. My scream caught in my throat. I stumbled backwards, my eyes wide with terror, still fixed on that grotesque finger. It was like something out of a nightmare, impossibly slender and unnervingly white against the dark wood. Then another finger appeared, and another. A hand, skeletal and unnatural, gripped the window frame. With a slow, deliberate movement, it began to pull the window upwards. The screech of old wood against glass seemed deafening in the sudden stillness. Dust billowed out as the window creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness within. Mrs. Gable chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Welcome home," she crooned, her unblinking eyes now gleaming with an unholy light. From the darkness of the attic window, something began to emerge. It was long and thin, like the fingers, but impossibly so. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its pale form barely visible in the dim light. More of them followed, their silent descent from the attic like a horrifying parade. They were all long and thin, their limbs moving with unsettling precision. Their heads were small and round, with no discernible features except for two dark, empty sockets where eyes should have been. They moved with a singular purpose, their attention fixed on me. And as they stepped onto the porch roof, I finally understood what Mrs. Gable had been watching for. They weren't watching my house. They were waiting for me. One of the creatures detached itself from the group and took a tentative step towards the edge of the roof. Its long, thin fingers twitched. I finally found my voice, a strangled gasp of pure terror. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I could hear the soft, skittering sounds behind me, the unnatural movements of those things as they followed. I ran across my lawn towards the street, towards any sign of life. But even as I ran, I could feel Mrs. Gable's unblinking gaze on my back, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, my heart banging against my ribs like a trapped bird. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder. The creatures were still there, their elongated forms moving with an unsettling speed, their pale fingers twitching in anticipation. Mrs. Gable stood on her porch, her unblinking gaze following my every move, that wide, terrifying smile still plastered on her face. I reached the street, my hope flickering as I spotted a car approaching in the distance. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms frantically, desperate for help. The car slowed, the driver looking at me with a mixture of confusion and alarm. But then, they saw what was behind me. Their eyes widened in horror, and instead of stopping, they slammed on the accelerator, swerving around me and speeding away. I was alone. The creatures were gaining on me. I could hear their soft, skittering steps getting closer, closer. One of them lunged, its impossibly long arm reaching out, its pale fingers brushing against my back. I screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. I stumbled and fell on the asphalt, scraping my knees and hands. I scrambled to get back up, but they were upon me. 3 of them surrounded me, their dark, empty sockets looming over me. Their touch was cold, like ice, as their long fingers grasped my arms and legs. I thrashed and struggled, but their grip was surprisingly strong, their movements unnervingly coordinated. I looked towards Mrs. Gable, a silent plea for help in my eyes. Her smile widened, and she slowly raised a hand, as if offering a silent blessing. The creatures began to pull me, their grip tightening. I could feel their thin, sharp nails digging into my skin. They dragged me across the road, back towards my house, towards the open front door that now seemed like the belly of some terrible beast. I screamed again and again, but no sound came out. My throat was constricted with fear, my lungs screaming for air. The world began to blur at the edges. They dragged me into my living room, the familiar space now filled with a chilling dread. I saw movement in the shadows, more of them emerging from the hallway, their silent forms filling the room. One of the creatures tilted its head, its empty sockets fixed on me. Then it opened its mouth. It wasn't a normal mouth, it was a gaping maw filled with rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth. The last thing I saw was Mrs. Gable standing in my doorway, her unblinking eyes filled with a dark satisfaction as the creatures descended upon me. The tearing started, and the darkness consumed me. The unblinking neighbor had finally shown me what they were watching for. The darkness wasn't an end, but a transformation. The tearing wasn't just the rending of flesh. It was the unraveling of my very being. My thoughts fractured, my fading like whispers in the wind. A cold emptiness filled the space where my fear had been, replaced by a singular gnawing hunger. I felt my form shifting, elongating, becoming thin and brittle like theirs. The frantic beating of my heart ceased, replaced by an unnerving stillness. My eyes widened, stretching until they felt impossibly large, and the urge to blink vanished. All that remained was a fixed, unwavering gaze. The world sharpened in a strange, unsettling way. I could sense the subtle vibrations in the walls, the quiet movements within the house. The house across the street, once my safe haven, now held a new kind of interest, a silent anticipation. I was no longer the observer. I was one of them now. Another unblinking eye in the shadows, another silent hunter waiting for the opportune moment. The scratching in the walls wouldn't stop. It would only multiply.